Russia, China, and Iran are coming closer and closer. Is this a mere coincidence, or are they teaming up against the West? How much will these alliances affect the world order? And is this the start of a new Cold War? Let's analyze from what we know. Let's see what each of them want. China wants more than just economic power. It wants to displace U.S. hegemony, rewrite the rules of global influence, and dominate Asia on its own terms. Russia, still haunted by the fall of the Soviet Union, craves respect, fear, and relevance. It wants to undermine NATO, fracture Europe, and restore its sphere of influence from Ukraine to the Arctic. Iran, cornered by decades of sanctions and foreign pressure, is playing the long game. It wants regional dominance across the Middle East, from Lebanon to the Red Sea, while surviving and outmaneuvering Western isolation. Each of these countries have different cultures. They belong to different civilizations. On paper, their alliance seems unbecoming, but they are bound together by sanctions, isolation, opposition to Western values, systems imposed by a common enemy. In this video, we will break down how these powers are stepping up military cooperation from drone tech to naval drills, how they're waging economic warfare, building systems to bypass the dollar and weaponize energy, and how they're using ideology and information to challenge democracy and sell the world a new kind of order. Before jumping into the most recent events, let's see how it began. After Russia took Crimea in 2014, the West hit back with tough sanctions. Cut off from Europe and the US, Russia needed a new partner, so it turned to China. This marked the start of Moscow's pivot to the East, a clear shift to build trade, investment, and political ties with Beijing. Trade between Russia and China grew fast. Before Crimea, China made up about 10% of Russia's trade. By 2021, that number jumped to nearly 18%. China also started funding Russian projects, building pipelines, investing in energy, and helping with major infrastructure. The two countries were becoming more connected than ever. Russia and China began coordinating on global forums, opposing the US-led system together. After Crimea, their relationship accelerated in both politics and trade. How did Iran find itself in the Axis? Well, after the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, things got messy. When the US reimposed sanctions and walked away from the deal, Iran felt cut off from the West, so it turned east, toward Russia and China. Tehran began building stronger trade, energy, and political ties with them, cementing a pivot driven by shared isolation and mutual need. When there's a mutual enemy, trust becomes negotiable. Quiet deals, back-channel military talks, and a growing axis that may soon challenge everything the West once dominated. From 2022 onward, the alliance starts to take shape. Iran sends drones to Russia, fueling the war in Ukraine and testing Western red lines. China stays silent, refusing to condemn Moscow, and defends Iran diplomatically on the global stage. Then came the military signals. Joint naval drills in the Gulf and Indian Ocean, shared military talks, technology transfers and discussions on arms sales. These are not just one-off moves. They're signs of a growing axis, one that's learning, coordinating, and preparing for a world no longer led by the West. For decades, global trade, especially oil, was priced in US dollars. This gave Washington enormous power. If you control the dollar, you control who gets paid. The Axis is trying to kill the dollar. Russia trades oil with China in yuan, sells gas to India in rupees, and signs energy deals with Iran in rials and rubles. The dollar isn't king anymore. China and Russia's bilateral trade reached over $240 billion in 2023, with 90% of it now done in yuan, and rubles up from just 20% a few years ago. Iran, locked out of SWIFT, and unable to access the dollar, has also started accepting yuan and bartering oil with both countries, even using cryptocurrencies in shadow deals. BRICS, which started as an economic club, is becoming a political weapon. It's expanding fast, adding Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other countries, turning into a bloc of resource-rich, anti-Western, or non-aligned powers. They're openly discussing a BRICS currency to replace the dollar in trade, possibly backed by gold, oil, or a basket of national currencies. Meanwhile, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, led by China and Russia, includes Iran and is growing into a strategic coordination group combining security and economic interests. If NATO and the EU are one pole, BRICS is the other. SWIFT has long been the backbone of global payments and a powerful lever the West uses to freeze out bad actors. But in response, Russia, China, and Iran are quietly building their own payment ecosystems. Russia's SPFS, launched in 2014 and now connected to nearly 180 banks across 24 countries, offers a SWIFT-style messaging system to keep trade flowing even under sanctions. China's CIPS, handling over 17 trillion yuan in transactions annually, and joined by more than 1,400 banks in over 110 countries, including recent participants from Africa, the Gulf, and Latin America, is rapidly expanding its global footprint. Iran's CPAM has already linked up with Russia's SPFS, creating a regional payment network that sidesteps Western control. Even African and Latin American nations are running pilot programs to trade in local currencies through these systems, signaling a slow but steady dismantling of the dollar-centric payment order. These visuals show what's happening beneath the surface. Since sanctions in 2022, China's CIPS network has tripled transaction volume and expanded to nearly 1,700 institutions across 119 countries. Meanwhile, SPFS, Russia's homegrown messaging system, now connects over 550 entities, with growing ties to Iran and neighboring states. By contrast, SWIFT still processes over $1.8 trillion in payments daily. But its dominance faces pressure. The yuan's share is inching upward, and an increasing number of nations are experimenting with local currency settlement. This shift isn't just technical, it's strategic. These systems are building the rails of a parallel financial universe, one where Washington's sanctions lose their bite. China, Russia, and Iran may stand together, but this alliance has cracks, because beneath the unity, each has its own agenda. Despite strong rhetoric, China did not provide Russia with lethal military aid during the Ukraine war. Western intelligence repeatedly warned against this, but China stuck to non-lethal support, like dual-use drones and tech, carefully avoiding a red line that would trigger secondary sanctions. After initial support, several Chinese state-owned banks began scaling back transactions with sanctioned Russian banks to avoid being targeted themselves by U.S. regulators. This showed clear risk aversion, prioritizing global exposure over alliance loyalty. President Xi never publicly endorsed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. While criticizing NATO expansion, he consistently called for respect for sovereignty and peaceful resolution language that subtly distances Beijing from Moscow's military actions. China will never seek hegemony or expansionism, and that all nations must respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity. President Xi Jinping, on the other hand, Russia relies heavily on China economically. After Western sanctions cut off Russian banks, tech, and markets, Moscow turned east. In 2023, China accounted for nearly 30% of Russia's trade, while Russia made up less than 4% of China's, a clear imbalance. Russia now sells oil at a steep discount, just to keep cash flowing, and relies on Chinese banks, Chinese electronics, and even Chinese currency to settle trade. Putin may talk of multipolarity, but in practice, Russia is becoming economically tethered to Beijing. While in Iran, the regime is fragile and increasingly volatile. The 2022 to 2023 protests, sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, saw millions take to the streets across over 100 cities, demanding change. The government's violent crackdown killed hundreds and jailed thousands, revealing how shaky its grip really is. Years of U.S. sanctions have crippled the economy. Inflation is over 40%, and youth unemployment is skyrocketing. Add to that deep political infighting, falling public trust, and a population that's increasingly disconnected from the clerical elite, and you get a regime that's not just isolated, but unstable. So far, it's been quiet coordination. But what happens if the pressure explodes? Here are the flashpoints that could force this alliance into the open. Taiwan has been a flashpoint since 1949, when China's civil war ended with the communists in Beijing and the defeated nationalists retreating to Taiwan. Since then, Beijing has called it a breakaway province. But Taiwan sees itself as sovereign, and the U.S. has vowed to help defend it. If China moves militarily, the stakes go global. Would Russia back China, as it expects China to back it in Ukraine? Would Iran offer drones, cyber support, or use the chaos to strike elsewhere? A Taiwan crisis could be the fuse that lights a global showdown, forcing this quiet alliance into the open. Ukraine is already a war zone, but escalation could redraw alliances. Russia is burning through weapons and drones, many of them supplied by Iran. If Western support grows, or NATO troops edge closer, could China step in with military or logistical aid? So far, Beijing has walked a careful line, but an all-out war could force a choice. Ukraine isn't just about territory anymore. It's a test of how far this axis is willing to go for each other. An Israel-Iran war would be unlike anything the region has seen. These two have been locked in a shadow war for years. Cyber attacks, proxy battles in Syria, assassinations of scientists. But since the Gaza war in 2023 and Israel's strikes deep inside Iranian territory in 2024, the gloves are coming off. Iran now openly arms groups across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Israel, in turn, has vowed to never let Tehran get a nuclear bomb, no matter the cost. If this turns into direct war, who backs whom? Russia has deep ties with Iran through Syria and shares intelligence and drone tech. It may not send troops, but diplomatic and logistical support is likely. China, which buys a third of Iran's oil, faces a harder choice. So far, it has called for restraint, but a regional war could force Beijing to pick a side or lose influence in the Middle East. This isn't just about missiles and borders anymore. It's about whether the world's emerging alliance system is ready to go to war. For decades, Saudi Arabia was the West's key ally in the Middle East. Oil for protection, petrodollars in dollars, and deep ties with Washington. But that relationship is changing. After feeling abandoned during the U.S. pivot away from the region, and seeing Washington hesitate to defend it after attacks on Saudi oil fields, Riyadh started exploring new options. In 2023, China brokered a surprise peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a diplomatic move once unthinkable. Riyadh also joined the China-led BRICS Plus, and now trades oil in yuan. Meanwhile, it's deepening energy and infrastructure deals with both Russia and China. It hasn't cut ties with the U.S., but it's no longer fully in Washington's camp either. If a new global order is forming, Saudi Arabia is hedging its bets. and quietly tilting east. If Riyadh goes further, backing China on Taiwan, staying neutral in an Israel-Iran war, or resisting Western sanctions, it could legitimize this rising axis in ways no one expected. Will this axis hold or crack under its own contradictions? Is the West prepared for a world it no longer controls? And if this is the next Cold War, where does that leave the rest of us? Subscribe for deeper dives into the shifting global order, because the next chapter is already being written.